Welcome to the What Matters Today podcast from the Geneva Graduate Institute. I'm Dan Graham, Head of Communications at the Institute. In this podcast series, we ask members of our faculty to comment on key global issues. Young people are often portrayed as politically disengaged, accused of turning their backs on voting and traditional politics. But is that really the full story? Recent waves of youth-led mobilizations, from climate marches to social justice movements, suggest something very different. So how do we explain this apparent paradox? Are young people truly stepping away from politics? Or are they reinventing it? In this episode, we'll explore what youth engagement looks like today, from the role of young voters in the United States to the issues driving activism across the global South. We'll also ask whether new forms of participation, both online and offline, signal a global movement or remain rooted in local priorities. And now that COP30 has wrapped up, we'll reflect on the lessons from years of youth-led climate activism. Have they managed to influence policy or shift mindsets? My guest today is Dr. Laura Boulan-Cassis, a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute's Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy. Laura, welcome to the show. Thank you for being part of it. My first question for you is, we often hear that young people no longer vote or have lost interest in politics. Yet recent waves of mobilization tell a different story. How do we explain this apparent paradox? And are young people truly disengaged, or are they simply reinventing the way politics work?
Look, for someone who has been researching young people's political engagement for a couple of years now, I have heard everything and its opposite about Gen Z and its forms of political engagements. There have been studies coming out saying that this is the most progressive generation ever. Others that have, quite to the contrary, been suggesting that they no longer believe in democracy and they're actually increasingly pro-authoritarian. Others as well that have been suggesting that they're disengaging from politics. So everything and the opposite has been said. And in fact, I'd warn against sort of broad sweeping statements about this generation and rather emphasize that there are multiple trends happening at once. What we do know is that on average, particularly across the global north, what we do see is that young people typically vote a little bit less, but they do vote en masse when issues come up that they care about or when candidates come up that they care about. Yep. So this does happen. And what we also know is that they exercise their voice in many more ways than through the ballot box. And as researchers, it's really important. Looking at just, voter turnout and participation numbers will not tell you the full story. We live also in a very sort of visual culture. There's a lot of ways of expressing yourself. And I'm increasingly seeing also research coming out that's looking at all sorts of different forms of engagement, from social media, to other cultural forms of expression like fashion, music, and others.
Yeah. Now, talking about going out to vote when you care about something, in the US, the election of New York's new mayor, Zohran Mamdani, saw remarkable youth participation. But how much influence did they really have on the outcome?
A very strong influence, I would say, in two ways. First is sheer numbers. So about twice the number of young people came out to vote in this mayoral election and compared to previous ones. It's still low in terms of used to be around 15%, or now it's around 30%. And among those who went out to vote, 75% voted for Mamdani. It is interesting, though, to disaggregate a little bit those numbers in that it's mostly young women and young people of color who voted for Mamdani, whereas young white men voted a little bit more for Cuomo than these other categories. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
So first is the sheer numbers. And second, it's also the kind of movement that young people started. So in the primary, Mamdani's victory was primarily led by young people. But what we saw in the general election is that this had been brought into all sorts of other demographics, including older folk of color, and different immigrant communities. And so what we really see is that this was a youth-led movement, but that others really followed. And this is through a number of different ways, different channels, amazing social media campaigns, but also grassroots campaigning across New York City.
Yeah, he did really well.
And so the comparison between the primary and the general, I think, are quite interesting as well.
And let's talk about the global South. So across the global South, what issues are driving young people to take action? Are their demands mainly social and economic, or is there a growing focus on democratic rights?
So the issues that have kind of spurred the movements that we have seen across the global south in the last 2 years have varied a little bit per country. So it sort of started off in Bangladesh in 2024. It's often dubbed the first successful Gen Z protest movement, in that it brought down the PM Sheikh Hasina. And this was primarily, it was spurred by a government job quota system reform and then transformed into sort of nationwide unrest. And in other countries, the issues were slightly different. In Nepal this year, the protests started primarily through concerns about economic inequality. We saw a viral online movement, hashtag Nepo babies, which was then sort of kind of triggered by a social media crackdown, which sort of angered and spurred even more mobilization. In the Philippines, it was mostly about corruption. So there are sort of individual specificities, but you do see some common trends. They have a few things in common. There is an anti-authoritarian component to these movements. We see that the crackdowns in these different countries really spurred and worsened things, made them better depending on how you look at them. So they really are against sort of entrenched power systems that had begun to kind of show their age. They're also primarily digital to begin with, but not only. And that's also quite important because I think this is an element that features both in the global south and the global north. They tend to be against what, some have called gerontocracy. So sort of a ruling by a geriatric elite in a way. There's some very elderly folk in power and often above 70. And this is not just a feature of global south or authoritarian politics, right?
No.
And so there was really something there that is quite interesting and very generational in nature. And so overall, even though the themes that kind of spurred these protests varied, they are about questions of representation, participation, equality, really, and those are all democratic features.
Yes. And you mentioned something interesting before about, there's more than just voting, right, that people can do.
Absolutely.
So what new forms of youth engagement are emerging worldwide? And can we speak of a global movement, or are these initiatives mainly local, shaped by diverse priorities?
So I'd warn a little bit against the notion of them being new or entirely new. For example, the protests that we've been seeing emerging over the last few years do have a genealogy in other forms of what Tufekci has called the networked protest. And these can be traced back to the early 2010s. You can think of the Occupy movement. Yes. You can think of the Arab Spring, the Indignados movement in Spain. There's multiple examples. So you can't say it's brand new, but you can say that the manners and the tools evolve. So one thing that I'm seeing, for example, is that some of the strategies that are used now are more sort of digital native strategies, for example, online on social movements. Really sort of, they know how to play the algorithm in a way, in ways that are savvier that when you could see in the past. And that's really interesting. Using Instagram infographics as educational tools, using, also embedding this in sort of this post-truth kind of narrative that we're living in, and using social media for fact-checking networks, counter-narrative campaigns, and also knowing when not to use social media and when to go to sort of encrypted messaging. So using, Telegram, using Signal. And so all of these are kind of new features that are really interesting and that these emerging movements are doing very well. So I would sort of qualify this question of novelty. And in terms of a global movement, I would also warn against that a little bit. I think there are cases of mimetism. So you see what happens elsewhere, and then it kind of spurs what can happen in a different country. You have movements that were global in name, like the Fridays for Future movement. It's a couple of years old now, but nonetheless, it did have all these local chapters, but then nonetheless were very different in nature and sort of some of the causes that it also advocated for on top of climate. But in any case, I would also say there are also drawbacks to a global coordinated movements. And it makes a lot of sense for youth movements to also be decentralized and adapt to local specificities too.
Now, this is a broad stroke question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Are young people, in fact, redefining democracy?
So a little. I would say that they're redefining perhaps not just democracy, but the political landscape in a way. And they are offering kind of a lesson for political parties too. Democracy and democratic participation, when you observe trends among young people, really shows you how much it needs to be earned in a way. They're not going to show up just because.
Right.
So you have to make it interesting for them, right? You have to make bold proposal and claims and really, show your accountability. And it is a lesson, I think, for progressive politics, youth movements, youth-led movements, but also what's going on when it comes to the increasing appeal of the right and including the extreme right among young people too. You are facing the risk of losing this younger generation to, very reactionary politics as well. And then a second sort of redefinition of democracy, if you like, is what we were discussing earlier, which is that just looking at the ballot box is not enough. There are different ways and pathways of participation that are emerging that are also a part of the democratic exercise. So they're forms of participation, but they're also increasingly a different language of participation. I don't know if you've seen the show Adolescence.
Yes.
Yes. And so one scene, and I'm not sure if the listeners have, but one scene that is very sort of telling, I think, is a scene where the lead investigator who is sort of looking into the case is speaking to his son and trying to understand what language are these young people speaking on social media, because he doesn't know. Yeah. He just doesn't know that they're actually communicating about all these questions around sort of masculinist politics and gender issues through emojis. So he's not able to read it. And so we have to learn also to speak different languages. So it's not just about the forms of engagement, but it's about the how.
Yeah. Yeah. Very interesting. And for my final question, I'd like to talk about COP, because you were just there. COP just wrapped up. So my question is, several years after the first climate marches, what lessons can we draw from youth-led environmental activism? And have they managed to influence public policy or shift mindsets?
So it's a complex question. There have been victories. So typically in the literature, you will see scholars pointing to sort of victories in climate litigation, which were spearheaded by young people, victories in terms of mainstreaming climate education, victories in terms of policies around net zero or countries declaring climate emergency, all being kind of traced back to the youth climate movement and its visibility.
Right.
There have also been some gains or some victories around a sort of a broader mindset shift. We've seen a much stronger generational consciousness around climate. So for a lot of young people, climate has become one of the issues that they're more sort of curious, interested, or even worried about. And also a discursive gain around terms like the climate emergency or climate justice, which have been mainstreamed quite a bit. But nonetheless, I mean, returning from COP, climate politics or global climate politics are very disappointing. There's a lot of rollback actually happening across the world. And so, of course, that is not the fault of the youth climate movement at all, but it does tell us a little bit about some lessons that can be learned. There's a couple that I can mention now that I've written about actually in some of my work. One is what is often dubbed the Greta effect, which is the danger of sort of celebrity activism, which is, again, not a fault of the movement itself, but also of all the media apparatus that's around them that sort of hyper focuses on specific young people, those who are, and it's always the same characteristic, they're kind of, charismatic in some way, or they're good speakers. Typically, they often used to be sort of young climate leaders from the global north rather than from the global south. So it's very selective, and it's detrimental to a movement, sort of leaderless strategies and identity as well. And also another that I've also been thinking about and have written about is that youth in particular can be an easily co-opted identity. And we've seen that a lot. So there's this term youth washing that has become a bit more well known now, and that we've seen quite a bit also during and sort of after in the aftermath of the youth climate movement. And so these are sort of warnings. And this is why I often like, and which is what I've done today, it's sort of nuance statements or claims about what young people believe in, about their forms of political engagement, to sort of avoid, broad statements that they might not recognize themselves in, singular narratives that might leave other narratives out. And this is why, it's more interesting to think about it in a complex and diverse way.
Laura, thank you. This has been very interesting. And thank you for joining us on this episode of What Matters Today.
Thank you for having me.
This podcast series is produced by the Geneva Graduate Institute Communications team. For more information about the Institute, please visit our website at graduateinstitute.ch. I'm Dan Graham. Thanks for listening.